I'd like to welcome everyone to the fifth of our series of the Masters of Supply Chain MasterSeries sessions. This is a little bit of a different session. We hope you enjoy it. So oftentimes our webinars have been in the format of Q&A with our guests. This time our esteemed guests will be doing more of a presentation, and they have some amazing content to share with you. I'd like to thank the Rutgers Business School for sponsoring this event, and in particular, to thank Rudy Leschner. Rudy is the Associate Professor of the Rutgers Business School and the Director of the Masters of Supply Chain program. Welcome, Rudy. And also Brody Sheldon. Brody is the Program Coordinator for the Rutgers Business School and Masters of Supply Chain program. Welcome, Brody. So I'll give you a little bit of some ground rules here. We're going to cover the presentation and have time for your questions. So please, along the way, if you'd like to use the chat function and offer up some questions, we'll get to them at the end. If they're particularly provocative questions, we may ask them of our panelists throughout the presentation itself. So feel free as you're going through to offer questions. We also will be recording this series, as we always do, and put it on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to go back and view us again, or if you'd like to share the content of this webinar with a friend or colleague, please feel free to do that. I'd like to, before we get started, introduce my co-host, Bob Ferlato. Bob is my partner on the board of the Rutgers Masters of Supply Chain program. He's currently COO of Avant Bio, a senior operations and supply chain guy with 20 years in the business. Really extensive experience in transforming and integrating end-to-end supply chains, and I'm happy and proud to work alongside Bob. So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you and we'll get started.
Well, thanks so much for the intro, Sunny. And as always, it's great to co-host another Rutgers Business School Master Series session with you. Pleasure to be here. If you've joined us previously, you know that Sunny is a supply chain expert with a unique ability to drive long-term results in high-performance cultures. She's held leadership positions in Fortune 50 corporate environments, as well as smaller and startup organizations. And Sunny's also a board member, as she mentioned, for the Rutgers Business School's Master of Supply Chain Management program. Again, it's great to be here. Tonight's session is entitled Risk Mitigation and Probabilistic Scenario Planning. Probability meets possibility. Now, this session promises to provide you with an alternative approach and emerging tool set to help drive more agile supply chains by moving to the next level of effective supply chain orchestration. In supply chains, as you know, risk is the constant variable that all supply chain professionals must mitigate in order to navigate toward reliable, agile, and profitable supply. Now, the older, well-established deterministic approaches in supply chain planning that focus on one number projected against one outcome in a highly complex, highly variable, and nonlinear supply ecosystem are perhaps outdated. To drive toward supply chain excellence, different thinking and different models are needed. And tonight's session is intended to provide you with alternative models and some takeaways to guide you down this alternative path. And before introducing our guests for this evening, I'll provide you with an intriguing suggestion. One of the best ways, perhaps, to embrace uncertainty in your supply chain approach to supply chain planning and orchestration is to learn to think like a professional gambler. So think about that. Our first guest this evening, Stefan de Kock, is co-founder and CEO of software development company Wahoopa, a company that focuses on probabilistic models and algorithms and applying them to unique and value-added planning solutions. Now, Stefan is on a mission to disrupt the supply chain domain. He seeks to make it better, more profitable, sustainable, equitable, efficient, stable, resilient, manageable, and overall pleasurable for all of us to work in. Stefan is passionate about math and the math that needs to be fixed, which he feels we have been applying inappropriately in the management of supply chains. In fact, Stefan and Wahoopa are currently in collaboration with Kinaxis which you may know as a supply chain management and sales and operations planning software company, a well-known company at that. So I'd like to welcome back Stefan to our webinar series and tonight's session. Stefan joined us 2 sessions ago in February, I believe. How are you, Stefan?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me back.
And I always like to play, where in the world is Stefan today?
I am right now in the Netherlands.
Netherlands, holy cow. So you mean to tell me that really it's past your bedtime?
It is past my bedtime.
My goodness. Well, you sound like you're at least as awake as the rest of us, so that's a good thing. Our next guest, Hank Saia, is a senior product manager of partner solutions at Kinaxis. And Kinaxis provides industry-proven applications and an extensible cloud-based rapid response platform that empowers planners, business leaders, and IT professionals to know sooner, act faster, and remove waste in our end-to-end supply chain, all things that we aspire to do. Now at Kinaxis, Hank is focused on helping partners build solutions on a Kinaxis platform, rapid response. Hank has extensive experience in ERP and supply chain planning software, holding various roles in product management, professional services, and sales for leading industry software vendors. Now get this, before his career in enterprise software, he spent nearly 10 years in corporate finance, specializing in strategic planning and financial reporting. That's impressive. So Hank also holds a bachelor's degree from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And Hank, welcome to you. Glad to have you here this evening.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate the invite. And, throughout this presentation, I'll be the yin to Stefan's yang, so to speak. So yin and yang. So look forward to the next hour.
Very cool. So, at this point, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Okay.
You can drive and then we'll try to interject here and there with some questions and comments and so forth.
Our QR code, so you can reach out to us anytime. And I will put in a plug for Stefan. He's got some amazing blog content on his LinkedIn. So feel free to go there, especially if you want to dive deeper into some of this math.
Yep.
So,
and my QR code actually takes you right to the article page of my LinkedIn profile.
Great. So to sort of set the stage, there's a new term that's sort of making the rounds, certainly in the analyst circles, but I think even in mainstream media, and it's polycrisis. So, it used to be that as a planner, you would work through, there was some global calamity or local, weather event that you had to plan around, or some supply disruption. And then there was a period of stability. And then the next crisis would occur. And now what we're seeing, and really it precedes the pandemic, right? So, we look at things like the China-US trade wars, the pandemic, various socio-economic and geopolitical crises. Certainly now between the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine, it just wreaks havoc on planners, right? How do you plan when, your demand is constantly disrupted by ultimately what you can produce? And that is a very real dynamic. So there are industries that were traditionally push supply chains, and, you manage that way, right? I sell what I can produce, but now demand-driven or traditionally demand-driven supply chains are exhibiting push behavior, right? It's not about forecasting what customers want, it's forecasting what we have to sell. Or these large gaps in demand, how do we manage and navigate through that? Obviously right now we're in a period of energy instability, particularly in Europe, but even globally. And it's putting, combined with other inflation, you have margin erosion. There are, it puts more of an emphasis on, as Bob said, our tagline at Kinaxis, removing waste, because you've got to balance these, these cost of goods sold and cost of sales impacts based on stability, energy, and inflation. Long lead times, on average, when I talk to one of my clients, their lead times are going from, 60 days to 180, 90 to 270. Client that Stefan and I are working with right now, they have lead times that are that have exceeded 1.5 years. How do you plan that far out into the future? And of course, what happens, obviously, when lead time increases, the first thing you need to do is buffer with additional inventory to cover that, right? It's part of the standard, inventory optimization equation. But of course, the challenge is everybody's jumping in. So as soon as the lead time, elongates, everybody tries to grab up supply, and it just makes the problem worse. And then, so, increasingly we're hearing, that you need to right size your inventory. Working capital pressure is immense right now. So companies are looking to, reduce inventory, optimize, and reposition, for maximum deployment flexibility. So, that's what's going on in the world. What are we hearing from clients? So,
Yep. So first of all, I think what I've been hearing a lot is that the planners at companies don't trust their own plans anymore. And the situation we've had before, where the downstream consumers of the plans, planners themselves often, right? A downstream consumer of a demand plan might be a supply planner, are also not trusting the plan, and that's getting worse. So your plan might say that you need a certain amount of safety stock, and the procurement people are second guessing that and purchasing more. So even the plans that we are making, we're differencing ourselves from them because we just don't trust them. The trust is gone in the whole supply chain.
So another thing we're hearing, is resiliency, and building resiliency, not just in your supply chain, but in your supply chain plan, is a top CEO priority. But the challenge is, of course, you can't build complete redundancy. We look at things like reshoring versus offshoring, but clearly that comes at a cost, right? So how do we create plans that that exhibit resiliency and agility without adding too much incremental cost, because we can only pass too much, so much on to consumers.
Yeah. The next thing we hear a lot is staffing issues, right? And they come in all different shapes and sizes. One that I hear a lot myself is the requirements of certain skill sets. Right, that if you're generating a statistical forecast, we need statisticians. If we're generating mixed integer optimized plans, we need OR PhDs and so forth. They're really hard to get. On the flip side, employees are hard to retain. So the talent that we do have, how do we keep a hold of them? And that gets worse now that we're dealing with the millennial generation and coming in also Generation Z. They tend to stay shorter periods with companies. They tend to hop. So the retainment problem is not getting any better. It's getting worse.
So the next thing, and I'll give credit to Gartner. So if you're familiar with Gartner, really the top analyst, or one of the top analysts in supply chain planning and in general in the vendor space. So they talk about offset strategies, right? So you have these major complexities in your supply chain, major disruptions. You need to do something different. So think of it as a fancy way of saying outside the box thinking. But the challenge with that is, of course, if you're in the planning organization and now the company wants to do something completely different, really, there's no historical basis for building, plans and a supply chain strategy off of that. So it puts more pressure, or it kind of pushes you away from the analytics, the traditional approaches, to one of scenarios and some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And then lastly, sustainability, we need to operationalize our goals, right? And so very topical, earlier today, we were on a roundtable with the chief supply chain officer from basically a Fortune 100 CPG company. And it was interesting because he said this was the number one thing that's keeping him up at night. And I frankly expected, any one of a number of things, but we've had sustainability goals splashed on our websites for a number of years now, right? But now we're getting to the point where we need to move towards that carbon neutrality that we're promising. And where does it come from? Getting supply chain planning a seat at that table within the organization is part of it, and some organizations are better than others at including supply chain planning. But the next step of it is clearly going to be within supply chain planning. And his point today was, 1% of the total carbon costs come from within his walls, and 99% is coming from upstream, tier 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 suppliers. So that's a key that needs to, that you need to manage today.
So what does this, where's this all coming from, right? We're hearing about all these problems. We're dealing with all this, these polycrises. So the root cause, in our belief, is that the world is what is a common term these days that you might hear is VUCA, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world is VUCA, but our forecasts and plans are not, right? And as humans, when we look back, we see one history, and then we tend to mirror that into the future and think there's only one future. But of course, we still control that, right? There's an infinite number of futures, and we pretend that the future is as certain as the past was. And what we do is that natural tendency that we have as humans, we built that into our planning systems and into our planning models and algorithms as well. And we're projecting these time series of exact numbers, and whether that's forecasts or plans, we say next month we're going to sell 100. It's not 101. It's not 99. It's 100, right? These are exact numbers, and this is really our own intuition, our own instinct letting us down, right? And the problem is that we need to adjust the math, right? The math is ill-fitting for the types of problems that we are trying to solve, right? And the cause of that, or the consequence of that, is all this firefighting that we're always in supply chain. And also all the second guessing that we're doing, right? The statisticians are second guessing the forecast, the OR PhDs are second guessing the optimization results. And this is in turn back to the need of the staffing that we have, the expertise we have, is because we've put this problem on our own plate for us to solve, right? So if we want to solve this problem, we really do need to fix the math, right? I don't want to diminish the importance of process and people and all those things. They're definitely important, but one of the things that I think has not gotten enough attention is the math, right?
Yeah, Stefan, I would agree with you. And I do have a question here. Yeah, so I've been as you know, you and I know each other for a number of years now, and I've been involved in an advocate of probabilistic approaches to supply planning and so forth for more than 20 years, from the time of, its infancy. But folks haven't gotten the picture. Our systems, as you indicated, are still hard-coded with deterministic math and deterministic approaches. Why do you think that is?
So, well, first of all, the one very old vendor, they were very protective of their intellectual property, right? And as a consequence, it was the best kept secret for decades. Mm-hmm. And now only, the supply chain is very slow to move to new, new approaches. And I've been blogging about this for 17 years. And it was an uphill battle, but I have changed in recent years. I'd say about 5 years ago, it started to become less of an uphill battle. And now I'm seeing people left and right of me that are, making the same messages that I am. So I am happy to see that. And I think, we're at the pivot point, and we are actually going to finally start seeing, an adoption that's more widespread than we have in the past.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, so you know, Stephen and I have both tried to resist putting too much sales pitch in this presentation, right? And just make it about the subject matter. That having been said, I'm going to make it more or less a shameless plug here. So, you know, to Stefan's point, there are a few niche providers that really focus on probabilistic. You know, I've known Stefan as well for about 20 years. And so the opportunity to really bring probabilistic planning into, you know, one of the leaders, you know, we are right now in the leader in the Gartner space, Magic Quadrant. You know, this was an exciting opportunity for us, right? And Gartner, for the first time, had in their most recent symposium, they had a session on probabilistic planning. Other of our competitors are now starting to get more into probabilistic concepts. So, you know, frankly, we want to lead that charge in partnering with WHOOPA.
Interesting. Thanks for that perspective. Appreciate it.
So how do we fix the math? Well, and that is the core of our discussion today. It's going to take probabilities and possibilities. And for that discussion, I'm going to be playing Mr. Probability here. And this is kind of a fun slide. We didn't want to make this too serious. And Hank will be Mr. Possibility today.
You know, and that picture,
name.
yeah, that picture probably looks like you. It's a little different. I haven't seen that one before. Okay.
It's closer to how I look today. Okay, so now if probability, if I were a trivia category, I would be science. Hank, on the other end.
Yeah, so I would be art, right? So Stefan wants to bring quantitative approaches, but you know, for parts of possibility planning, it's scenario based, right? And it more of an art today than a science. Now, if I were a Marvel movie, I would be Doctor Strange in the multiverse of madness, right? Meaning possibilities are really infinite. And, you know, certainly we try to drive direction down to, you know, what might be feasible for our organization, but there's no you know, limit to the possibilities that we need to navigate.
And if I were a Marvel movie, I would be Infinity Wars. You know, there's an infinite number of possibilities, but it's all within a single universe. So probabilities allow for all these different options, all these different potential outcomes, but with one set of assumptions, right? One universe. Now, if I were a Moneyball character, and I don't know if everyone's seen the movie Moneyball, but this is about a poor baseball team that are basically beating the big guys by switching from a traditional scouting approach, looking for talent, and taking a data science approach to getting the right players and combination of players to achieve certain KPIs. And I would be Jonah Hill character, which is the nerdy guy that does the math.
Yeah, and I would be Brad Pitt, and probably the only time that I'll ever be able to say that in my life. But basically, you know, as Billy Beane, the general manager that really pioneered the analytics, you know, traditionally baseball general managers worked on gut feel, right? What passes the eye test, and he was instrumental in bringing more quantitative approaches to prospects and team building. And that's more or less what we're trying to do here as well. So if I were a soundbite, I would be free jazz. Now I'm going to confess that before we started planning this presentation, I didn't know what free jazz is, but if you've ever heard that really unstructured, improvisational, you know, riffing that, you know, musicians do that for us might sound like noise, you know, that's basically what possibilities are. It's, you know, it's very unstructured, and improvisational, but you need to collaborate with different, you know, in this case, members of your organization, just like a band would.
Now, if I had gone to one of those free jazz sessions and I came home lying awake in bed at night, I'll be hearing that ringing in my ears, right? That's this noise, this white noise that's ever present, and you know it's going to continue for a while longer. As a, and probabilities are all about taking that signal and pushing it forward into the future. And then finally, now, if we were math, and I'm not sure if everyone can see it on my screen, it's dropping off at the bottom, but I would be the curvy statistic, whereas Mr. Possibility over there, he is that fuzzy triangle. And there's a link to what that mathematical concept is that we'll also get into a little bit further today.
I like that.
So let's take a look at those two concepts separately, right? We've talked about probabilities and possibilities, but to give you guys a flavor of what each of these is, I'll start with the probabilities. So what it does is it's looking at historic data, and it's looking at the variances and the patterns in the past, and it's trying to predict that forward. So it's pushing and predicting a variance into the future that's subjected to some set of assumptions, right? Now, everyone's seen the bell curve. It assumes that your upside and your downside risks are the same. In practice, what we see in supply chain is very few occurrences of these normally distributed quantities. Instead, we see these skew distributions. So your upside risk may sometimes be greater than your downside risk, or vice versa. So as an example, if you're doing an inventory optimization, you're trying to balance how much inventory. If I do more inventory, I can get a higher service, so I have less lost sales. But if I have too little inventory, I'll have more sales, but at the same time, I have a higher risk of waste or obsolescence if the product expires and so forth. So there's always this downside, and those risks are A, not equal, and B, they might not have the same value even if they occurred in equal amounts, right? And similarly, if you're planning for capacity, you could say, hey, we're going to target 90% of utilization will be okay. But unless we look at it probabilistically, we might be sometimes getting into time periods where there's an unexpectedly high peak and our capacity still isn't enough, right? So we know that we can anticipate a certain percentage of those peaks. We know that we might have to pre-build a little bit more in certain times of the year. Now, those assumptions that I mentioned in the first bullet, they can be all kinds. So the typical assumption, if we're doing operational planning, is what if business continues as usual, right? We predict, we create a forecast, we create a plan, simply assuming that the variance that we're seeing in the past is going to equal that in the future. An event that happens in the past will have the same impact in the future. A promotion we run in the past will have the same effect as if we run that same promotion in the future. And it deals with all kinds of smaller kinds of impacts, such as what if a bottleneck machine breaks down, or what if I accept a big order? What's that going to do to my other orders? Will I still be able to serve all the other ones? And it might not be as simple as, oh, you're going to miss one order. Instead, it could say, well, there's these 10 orders that are suddenly at risk of being missed, right? And finally, any imagined scenario that we can that we can contemplate, and that if that comes to pass, what's the output, right? Now, if we want to determine those scenarios, now we're talking about possibilities.
So possibilities, again, they're endless, right? And they might be things like expansion into a new geography or building a new plant. It could be disruption events, right? Like a supplier's plant burns down and there's some constraints, right? So these are a combination of internal choices, right? Things that we can affect and control to some degree, or external disruptions, right? And clearly we're so hyper-focused today on disruptions, right? Ever since the pandemic, we hear building risk and resiliency plans to counter disruptions, but I'd argue that opportunities could potentially have as much of a shock to your supply chain as a disruption, right? What if we finally land that big account that we've been trying to for 3 years? How do we supply that? How does our portfolio change, and so forth? And all of these things need to be modeled really through scenarios today.
So gentlemen, I have a question for you, for either of you. What about how a supply chain practitioner makes decisions based on these probabilities and possibilities? Can you give an example either from your clients or some other example to help us see how going through the exercise of looking at probabilities and possibilities feeds into my need to make decision making, and how might that lay out?
So from a probability perspective, this is, as Bob also mentioned, this has been around for a long time. And for the end user, not much changes, right? There's usually a graphical representation of the uncertainty around whatever is the plan or the forecast that you're already used to. So you have a little bit more information. It's not just we're going to sell 100, but hey, within the 95% probability, we're going to be in another range. It makes it easier to make better informed decision. It doesn't really affect the process too much. On the possibility side, this is more forward looking, right? This is not as settled yet. I don't know if there's many or any software or systems out there that really take care of these possibilities. But there's an interesting series of articles, 3 in a row in the Foresight magazine, for those of you who have subscribed to Foresight, editions 63, 64, and 65 last year. Paul Goodwin and Steve Morlich wrote the first 2, and I wrote the third one of the series, where we actually discuss these how these possibilities work, how you apply them to scenarios, and how they could potentially interrelate with probabilities.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so traditionally, possibilities are managed through scenarios within S&OP, right? So, S&OP often is a waterfall type approach, which, again, shameless plug, that's something that we at Kinaxis really break, this siloed approach through our concurrent planning app. But today, as Stefan's talking about some of the math and where we can go, and I think we're going to elaborate on that. But today, traditionally, it's managing scenarios, building consensus, and then typically scorecards, leveraging organizational KPIs to help bring some, consensus building around the best scenario that you can execute.
I do think that it does change the way these meetings are conducted and some of the thinking that goes into it. For example, too often leaders really are under pressure to appear decisive and attempt to deal with complex issues with these simple deterministic rules or analogies. And now, trying to merge probabilistic approaches with possibility is unique. And I think does bring a different framework to whether it is you do sales and operations planning or you're more mature and do integrated business planning. So just think about that. And moreover, as a planner in these complex nonlinear systems, you really need to think about and sort of get angry about the fact that a lot of the models utilize this deterministic thinking, which again, perhaps is outmoded. So just some thoughts and comments on what you guys are talking about here.
Yeah, appreciate that, Bob.
Definitely. We spoke about these 2 concepts, probabilities and possibilities, and I see these as a marriage, right? These 2, we are intending for these 2 to marry. And just like any old marriage, not only do you need to have opposites which attract, but you need to have enough things in common. And probabilities and possibilities have that, right? So they both aim to mitigate risk. They both aim to grab opportunities. They both aim to prepare for the expected unexpected, if you will, or what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the known unknowns, right? And finally, they accept the fact that there is uncertainty and they model it, right? So you don't want to be that person standing in the surf trying to hold back the waves. You want to be the one standing on the surfboard on top of the waves and riding it. And that's really what both of these probabilities and possibilities are trying to achieve. Right, so I have a shared dream, if you will. Now, if you just to give an example, right? These concepts might be a little abstract. So if we think about hurricane planning. Hank, I don't know if you want to take on the strategy here.
Yeah, so if you think of hurricane planning and even just in general risk and resiliency, right? So there are data signal providers that are focusing on risk alerts and so forth. So you get this risk alert, and you manage very operationally. But how do you look at a potential major disruption if you're in a threat area? You can't react days before a hurricane's going to hit landfall, right? So you need to think strategically and more proactively, and where we're going is predictively, right? So we want to understand from at a seasonal level, is this year an El Nino year, and we're going to have an increased threat and potentially higher category storms that we need to plan around, right? And so like I said, if the hurricane is 2 days out, you can't move inventory out of that threat area, right? You've already, your plan is already solidified, so you can't, it's hard to shift capacity around. You want to do this more at a strategic layer. So looking at network resiliency, looking at things like, understanding capacity and how to shift if you need to very quickly, building some level of redundancy in your supplier network. So if a supplier is under a threat, you can look to shift requirements over to another supplier, right? So this is all about possibilities, and they come with cost and consequences. We'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah. So now the hurricane is building on the ocean, right? And it's going to land. You don't know where it's going to land and how big it's going to be when it's landing, but you now have an imminent threat. And say you're in the business of selling bottled water, or maybe you're in the business of selling wooden boards that people might use to board up their stores or their homes in advance of a storm, right? This is the time when all that capacity that you've strategically built with warehouses in the right spots, you're going to pre-populate some of those forward warehouses where you expect the storm may hit. You may hold some back, right? Maybe there is a central distribution center serving 10 different forward locations that are all at risk of getting hit. 2 or 3 of them might be, but you don't know which one. But that DC is most certainly going to serve one of them that's going to get hit. You'll build up extra capacity to be ahead of the curve there. Conversely, if you're in the business where you have sensitive stock, maybe you're storing medicine and the warehouse is at risk of being flooded, maybe you want to do the opposite, right? Pull it out of the risk area at that moment in time. So you're basically putting everything tactically in position, and you're using a probabilistic approach to try and determine, where that needs to happen with what kind of probability.
Yeah, and so then operationally, you've made your plans and you're aligned for the best potential outcome. But of course, based on where that storm, really hits, it's either going to be, closer to you or further away, right? So at this point, you're in a triage mode. And so how do we, make minor shifts in demand, because we clearly can't do major shifts? Do we need to put products on allocation because, the peak of the storm was a little bit higher than we planned for, and looking at last mile deployment, what can we do given, to adjust our tactical plans based on the final outcome, which at this point is a certainty. This example for me is certainly, hits home. One of my clients that's in the home repair business, former clients, they one of the storms that hit Texas completely leveled, took out 3 DCs, and because they hadn't planned for it, it took literally 3 to 4 months for them to fully recover, moving supply into that hard hit area, but also fulfilling demand from alternate locations because those DCs were completely shut down.
Yeah, and we brought that example of a hurricane because I think it's kind of enlightening, but at the same time, being in supply chain, imagine the hurricanes that are raging through your business, right? It's not just a literal example; it's a figurative example as well.
So Stefan, the next couple of slides. So just in the interest of time,
yeah, I'll move quick.
Yep.
So traditionally, we're creating plans. We're creating these series of quantities going forward. Now, if we look at it probabilistically, instead of saying we're going to take a line that moves a curve forward, we're going to apply for every point in time. We're going to create these probabilities. And so we get these waivers, if you will, of future potential, right? And the shades here are indicative of darker is more probable, lighter is less probable. If we go the other directions from plan, we create multiple scenarios. We're now trying to come up with maybe best case, worst case, most likely, or what if the interest rates rose, or what if the recession occurred. Again, we're creating for every scenario a single potential outcome. Now, when possibilities meet probabilities, right? Now we're going to have these waivers for every single scenario. If the interest rates increase to 10%, there's a range of outcome. It's not one outcome. There's a whole range, a whole waiver of outcome, right? If the recession hit, there's a wave of outcomes. So this is much more representative of what happens in the world, right? And that's how we want to model it. So we believe that there's this emerging future where these two concepts will be more widely embraced and will meet. And just to put them side by side, the probability has this, this curve, somewhat skewed bell curve typically, and the area underneath the curve is always 1. Now, it's a big ask from a business executive to say, hey, for your scenarios, can you draw a probability curve of how likely do you think each of these scenarios is going to happen, right? Nobody's going to do it. That's not how humans think. So this is where the fuzzy math possibility concept comes in. And instead of this curve, we say, let's draw a triangle. The bottom left is the worst case. The bottom right is the best case. And the top is the most likely case. And there's some variations possible to the triangle, but for all intents and purposes, that's how simple it gets. And we just assume that the possibility is 1 at the most likely and 0 at the 2 extremes. Anything beyond that is 0, and in between it's line. Now, as a consequence, the area isn't exactly 1, but mathematically we can get around that. But we've just made life a lot easier to still put some kind of estimate on likelihood that a business person can do, right? Only 3 scenarios needed. So how would this work? So in historically, let's assume we've created these 5 scenarios ranging from worst case to best case, and we might have created an expectancy across it. And we see, what? They're on a straight line in yellow one, the middle one's just above 0. we're good, right? Our expectancy is we're going to come out of this positive, but not every scenario is equally likely. So if we add the possibilities, maybe this changes, right? Maybe there's an effect that happened. And conversely, if we add the probability, so let's take the most likely scenario here, we can draw a curve and say, well, what's likely going to happen? And yeah, the peak is roughly around the spot where we thought the expectancy was, but there are these tails that may not be symmetrical, right? So if we simplify that, it might look like this: a box plot. Many of you might have seen box plots, and 50% interquartile range is the box, and the 25% that you might be above that 50 is on the top, and the 25% chance that you're underneath is at the bottom. And you very often see this asymmetrical pattern. And we can do that for all of these scenarios. Each of these will have its own probabilities, if you will. And now we can combine these combinations of possibilities and probabilities, and that's where I think we're going. So first of all, you can now calculate an overall expectancy across all these possibilities, across all these probabilities. What's the expectancy? But that's not enough to make a decision on, right? If I were to tell you, hey, if you give me $1 and roll a dice, and if it's a 6, you get $10, right? You're going to do it because there's a greater chance of winning than losing. But if I tell you, hey, you give me $10,000, and if you roll a dice and it's a 6, I'll give you $100,000. Well, you might think twice, because now there's a big risk of losing $10,000, right? 5 times out of 6. And even though the expectancy is the same, right, you're going to win proportionately the same, the risk is different, right? So you do have to take into account this concept of risk. And that is really, what's our chances that we're actually going to lose on this, right? And everyone will do that differently, I think. But those are two sides of the coin, that once we deal with probabilities and possibilities, it gets a little bit tricky, and depending on your aversion to risk, you might lay that balance differently, right? So that's a little bit of art, again, that comes into added to the science.
Yeah, and adding the financial lens to this too, again, these are going to come at a cost, right? So, what is the impact of these various scenarios to, the bottom line, the P&L, to our the plan that we've committed to the street, et cetera. And is there the potential to hedge across scenarios where we have, for example, inventory? Can we plan an inventory buffer layer above and beyond safety stock that would cover us? So if demand does exceed forecast, the best case scenario, we have at least a little bit of a bridge to that. Speaking of bridges, so pragmatically, what does this mean for you today? So clearly, what we just presented is, it's math that Stefan's working on. It's, functionality that we're working on, but how do we get there, right? That's tomorrow. So what can we do today to, basically build the best foundation to take advantage of some of these technologies as they happen. So first of all, as Bob and Stefan and I both are all mentioned, there are probabilistic tools today, and even vendors that don't have true probabilistic planning like we do, have some level of stochastic planning. People are looking at things like Monte Carlo analysis. It's a stepping stone to a stronger base, which is probabilistic planning, right? And these both deal with uncertainty much better than deterministic formulas. Then again, shameless plug, but one of our strengths, probably our absolute strength at Kinaxis, is the fact that you need not just scenario planning, but end-to-end, not just in supply chain planning, but end-to-end, meaning the entire breadth of your supply chain management, right? So into the orchestration or execution layer, but it also needs to be concurrent, right? We need to move away from these waterfall type approaches, and that's what we bring to the market. For the short term, we're still going to manage through KPI driven scorecards and so forth, but the ability for anybody to create scenarios and move to a consensus or operationalize that scenario, that's what we have today. Then, really where WHOOPA and Kinaxis, so certainly Stefan and I have been working towards this for a while, is so now if we've got this scenario, how do we add this possibilities math, right? What scenarios are most likely, what are the risk reward trade-offs, and how can we bring analytics to that? So that's probably 2, 3, 4 years away, but we're working towards that. And then the final stage that we see from an evolutionary perspective is, okay, now we've got this basic, this math, right? But how can we improve the efficacy of the math through machine learning and using, external and internal data points that potentially could enhance the algorithms? So that for us will be, really the final step in this journey that we're on today. And so, from a key takeaway perspective, right, just to, before we go to questions, uncertainty, global volatility, it's just not going to go away, right? And if anything, the next, 3 to 5 years, it might, it's going to worsen. How bad, we'll see, right? So you need to do something. You need to embrace that uncertainty and manage to it. Second point is, from a supply chain perspective, we are already looking at emerging technologies. Stefan mentioned mixed integer linear programming, right? AI, particularly in demand planning, creating digital twins, control towers. So there's a lot of technology, and supply chains right now are embracing it. So the next piece for us is the next wave we see, and it's already starting, like I said. Gartner's talking about it. Other competitors are trying to build some level of stochastic planning, but probabilistic and possibilities math is the next wave. And then the final point is, perfect is the enemy of good, right? So you can start today embracing tools that are going to, give you both some level of managing possibilities through, robust scenario planning, but also probabilistic planning that can ultimately, bring a quantitative approach both inside of a possibility, and potentially the likelihood of a possibility. And that's what we've prepared for you today.
So that's an interesting thought. So, if I'm sitting here listening and I hadn't been exposed to this, I'd be wondering, okay, so what can I do tomorrow? I think at the very least, if you're not familiar with these probabilistic approaches and certainly the possibilities type approaches, you're suggesting that one of the things that people can do, I think, you tell me if I'm mistaken, is to find out what if their current systems are supporting or working with probabilistic models, or whether they're still deterministic. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's, somewhat self-serving for us that, we think right now we are the one platform-based solution that's got true probabilistic planning embedded. But we know our competitors are frankly looking at it as well. So, look, we'd love to sell software and, have a bunch of the attendees here go off to our website and start looking at it. But, that's a big, investment, right? So, look at and encourage your existing vendors, to bring more stochastic or probabilistic, techniques and tools into, their logic as well. And, frankly, there are ways you can even augment, if you have any of the other solutions, augment it with, say a certain footprint of, rapid response and WHOOPA.
Hank, that's a really good point in terms of demanding of our vendors and suppliers to be thinking differently as we emerge as well. So thank you for that. I do know there are a number of questions that have hit both the chat and the Q&A. So we have a couple of minutes left. Brody, will you handle that for our panelists and let's take those questions.
Sure. So this question is from Josh Borders. Let's say we have calibrated a probabilistic demand forecasting model so that we can be confident the model contains about 95% of the true outcomes. How does a planner or decision maker actually use this forecast to make an order? Are these forecasts just used as a baseline to make human judgment based off of whatever risks and opportunities the business has?
So if all you had was a probabilistic forecast, then you have to convert it pretty quickly into a deterministic number, right? Now, if it was a true probabilistic forecast, it would accommodate the skew in the distribution. So you will just simply by taking the median of the distribution, get a better number than if you had not had a probabilistic forecast at that point. But you know, it's a limited, you get an accuracy bump, but that's where the bug stops. Now, where it gets interesting is once you start adding more, right? Then you can integrate the probabilistic signal without simplifying it first, right? That can go into your inventory optimization. And then, yes, you can still get a very deterministic reorder level or safety stock levels out of that, but you've preserved that information. It's like going to the casino, going back to Bob's suggestion that we all think as gamblers. You go to the casino and you're going to play craps with 2 dice, and all you get told is that on average you're going to throw 7. You're gonna, leave empty-handed pretty quickly. But if you know what the odds are, you have a much better shot of actually coming out winning, right? And so the longer you can preserve that probabilistic signal from planning model to planning model, the more benefit you're going to see. But even with one, you're going to see, a nice bump.
Yeah, and if I could add a point, when you have very, very slow moving stock, right, the long tail of demand, we all use cross-tins, right? Or that's traditionally what you use, some variation of cross-tins. But, the reality is that, things you sell 2-3 times a year, they're nearly unforecastable in most deterministic solutions, right? Where probabilistic, frankly, is the best technique to even get a forecast that's usable.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Okay. Regarding the global energy crisis, because the war continues to rage on, do you anticipate as long as the war continues, the threat of energy crisis will remain through 2024, impacting supply chain?
Absolutely. It's, unfortunately, it's likely to go far beyond that, right? Because so the war is clearly, especially Europe, it's affecting Europe, right? Because they're supplied predominantly from Russia. But beyond that, there are sustainability goals that, are looking, where we might want to restrict, where we can drill, right? And, I would say even going back to the push against nuclear, which could be a more sustainable energy alternative, it's going to be a while before we can really embrace some of the greener energy sources and stabilize. We're not going to get off carbon in the short term, right? So, but it is likely to result in higher energy costs, as we try to make that transition from carbon to more sustainable energy sources.
Yeah, and you can imagine it like the ships waiting in front of Longwood Beach. The moment that the COVID situation at the source was resolved, the traffic jam in Longwood Beach still lasted for months longer, right? And that's the same with anything in supply chain. If you disrupt the flow, the disruption lasts much longer than the initial impulse to it.
Great, thank you. Do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay, so uh, this is one of our guests. I work in supply chain / logistics. As a practitioner, no matter how we plan and prepare ourselves, risks are inevitable. I work for international organizations. During COVID, our only suppliers were in China because I was based in Western Pacific. With COVID, it was not easy. How can we respond quickly and efficiently to end users without spending more than agreed and in great transparency with quality goods and respect to delivery?
So I would say there is not a terrible amount you could have done, right? Nobody expected this pandemic to happen. So if we think back to the hurricane, we're looking strategically, tactically, and operationally. The strategy part here is based on what, for all intents and purposes, was an unknown unknown, right? So the moment it hits, you're already in firefighting mode. Now that said, now that we know that COVID is around, we know that we can expect, like whack-a-mole, that there's going to be these localized areas where a new variant might come up, right? So that is something that we can plan for. But yeah, the initial one, if you were selling toilet paper, who could have seen it coming, right? So there is a limit to what you can achieve, even with the best of math.
And that's where scenarios and really what's the we want to make a rapid response and we want to align organizationally on what that is, right? There's a point where there are no good answers. So you just, try to get to the best plan that you can, given the challenges you're facing. And I think that question also came in earlier, where we talked about what can be done with maybe less, with a more minor disruption, something like the pandemic, that nobody can plan that.
Fabulous. Really good insight. Appreciate it, Sonny. I think this was another really good session to help people think differently, learn about some different approaches that are emerging, and maybe take a few things away that they can implement tomorrow.
Yeah, I think there's a high probability that this one will be downloaded from YouTube.
You
more
were
than
just
some of the others.
you were just waiting to get that in there, right, Sonny?
Just came to me.
We didn't rehearse that. Yeah.
I didn't. Well, thank you, everyone. Rudy, do you want to wrap us out?
Yes, so thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our panelists. And as Sunny hinted, you will hear from me with a recording of this session if you signed up. We will post this session on our YouTube channel. And please be sure to subscribe to it so then you get all of the updates. And there are always future sessions planned, and we look forward to welcoming you there.
Thanks again to Hank, Mr. Possibility, and Stefan, Mr. Probability.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Have a great night. Take care.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everyone.
Cheers,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.